At 78, Caleb Snyder believed the greatest heartbreak of his life was watching his only son choose profit over family. After Ryan Snyder secretly sold the apartment building, Caleb had spent 40 years maintaining Caleb and his wife. Margaret found themselves with nowhere to go except an abandoned Carnegie Library in the forgotten farming town of Ash Grove. The silence inside felt heavier than grief itself. But on their very first night, as the clock struck midnight, an enormous bookcase groaned and slowly swung open without a single hand touching it. From the darkness beyond came the voice of an elderly woman soft enough to be almost imagined. "Someone finally came back? If you've ever wondered whether kindness can outlive betrayal, stay until the end of Caleb and Margaret's extraordinary journey." The road into Ash Grove narrowed with every passing mile. What had begun as a 4-lane highway outside Columbus slowly surrendered to 2 cracked lanes bordered by endless fields of soybeans and weathered fences. The farther Caleb Snyder drove his aging pickup truck, the quieter the world became. Traffic lights disappeared. Shopping centers gave way to grain silos. Even the radio signal faded until only soft static remained. Neither Caleb nor Margaret complained. There seemed to be nothing left worth saying. For nearly 50 years, silence had never lived comfortably between them. Caleb had always filled long drives with stories from work memories from military service or impossible dreams about the fishing cabin they would someday buy after retirement. Margaret usually laughed, teasing him that he had planned that imaginary cabin longer than most people planned their entire lives. Today, the silence felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of 2 people trying not to break in front of each other. Caleb tightened both hands around the worn steering wheel. His fingers, once powerful enough to lift engine blocks and repair entire apartment buildings alone, now trembled almost constantly. Arthritis had stiffened every joint, but the ache in his hands barely registered anymore. The pain inside his chest was louder. Beside him, Margaret watched endless rows of corn disappear through the passenger window. A small cardboard box rested on her lap, containing the few keepsakes she had refused to leave behind. Their wedding photograph, a faded Christmas ornament painted by Ryan when he was 6, Caleb's Bronze Star certificate from his years in the Army, a tiny porcelain bird that had sat on their kitchen windowsill for nearly 30 years. Everything else had stayed behind. Not because they wanted it to, because there had been no time. 3 weeks earlier, Caleb had awakened believing he still owned a home. By sunset, he had become homeless. It had happened so quietly that even now it barely felt real. Ryan Snyder had always been ambitious. Caleb used to admire that. As a child, Ryan had talked endlessly about becoming successful building businesses, owning properties his father could only dream about. Caleb had smiled every time. "I hope you do better than I ever did," he often told his son. He meant every word. When Caleb retired at 75, Ryan had insisted on taking over management of the small apartment building Caleb had maintained for decades. "Dad, you've earned your rest," Ryan had said warmly. "Let me handle everything now." Caleb believed him without hesitation. Why wouldn't he trust came naturally when love had never given you a reason to question it? The building itself had never made anyone rich. It was an aging brick property with 18 modest apartments, occupied mostly by retired teachers, widows, delivery drivers, and young families starting over after difficult times. Caleb knew every tenant by name. He remembered birthdays. He repaired broken heaters without charging overtime. Sometimes when someone fell behind on rent because of illness or job loss, Caleb quietly paid the difference himself, rather than see a family evicted. Ryan used to call those decisions bad business. Caleb called them being human. Over time, Ryan visited less often. Phone calls became shorter. Conversations became almost entirely about money, property values, investments, taxes, development opportunities. Whenever Caleb mentioned the tenants, Ryan responded with numbers instead of names. "They're paying below market value. That neighborhood is appreciating. We're sitting on an underused asset." Caleb never realized how differently they saw the same building. To Caleb, it was a community. To Ryan, It was real estate. The truth arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Caleb had been pruning flowers outside the entrance when unfamiliar SUVs pulled into the parking lot. Men wearing business suits stepped out carrying folders. One introduced himself politely. "Mr. Snyder, we're here on behalf of the new ownership." Caleb laughed. "I think you've got the wrong address." The man exchanged uncomfortable glances with another representative before carefully opening his folder. "The property transferred ownership 6 weeks ago." Caleb frowned. There must be some mistake. There isn't. The representative produced signed legal documents. Ryan's signature appeared on every page. So did Caleb's. Except, Caleb had never signed them. At first he assumed they were forged. Then came the explanation that shattered everything. Months earlier, Ryan had convinced Caleb to sign what he described as routine retirement paperwork. Insurance forms, tax documents, maintenance authorizations. Caleb hadn't read every page. He trusted his son. Hidden among the paperwork had been legal transfer documents granting Ryan complete authority over the property. Within weeks, Ryan sold it to a development company planning to replace the apartments with luxury condominiums. Every resident received eviction notices, including Caleb. When Caleb called Ryan, the conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. "You tricked me," Caleb whispered. "I protected our future. You took our home. I increased our assets." "Our assets?" Caleb asked quietly. "Or yours?" Ryan sighed impatiently. "Dad, you're making this emotional." "I am emotional. That's the problem." Caleb waited. He expected an apology, an explanation, anything. Instead, Ryan said something Caleb would never forget. "You and Mom are old now. You don't need that much space anyway." The line went silent. Not because Ryan hung up, because Caleb no longer knew what words still existed between a father and a son after hearing something like that. Margaret found him sitting alone on the apartment steps nearly an hour later. He still held the phone. He looked exactly like the young soldier she had met decades earlier after receiving news that several friends would never come home from overseas. Not crying, just emptied. She sat beside him without speaking. Eventually, Caleb handed her the phone. "I think we lost our boy." Margaret listened to the voicemail Ryan had left after ending the call. She closed her eyes, then quietly deleted it. Not out of anger, out of mercy. Neither of them needed to hear those words again. Over the following days, neighbors packed boxes while developers measured buildings. People Caleb had helped for years hugged him with tears in their eyes. Mrs. Patterson, an 83-year-old widow, kissed his cheek before leaving. "You gave me dignity when no one else would." A young mechanic shook Caleb's hand. "I only survived after my divorce because you let me pay rent late." Children waved from moving trucks. Families promised to keep in touch. Most never would. That was how life worked. Communities didn't always disappear with explosions. Sometimes they vanished one moving truck at a time. Caleb and Margaret packed what fit inside the pickup. Everything else was donated, discarded, or abandoned. The fishing rods Caleb had collected for 30 years. Margaret's piano, books, furniture, photographs too large to carry. A lifetime reduced to whatever would fit beneath a faded blue tarp tied across the truck bed. Neither complained. Possessions could be replaced. Trust was harder. A week later, they arrived in Ashgrove after answering a small newspaper advertisement seeking volunteer caretakers for an abandoned Carnegie library awaiting a final council decision on demolition. The town couldn't afford security. The building had no electricity beyond a few functioning circuits. No heating except an aging wood stove. No plumbing beyond one working sink. Mayor Daniel Harper met them on the library steps. He was in his early 60s, practical kind, and visibly embarrassed by what he was about to offer. "I'm sorry," he admitted. "It isn't much." Caleb looked up at the century-old stone building. Tall arched windows, massive oak doors, weathered limestone walls wrapped in ivy. Despite the peeling paint and broken gutters, It possessed a quiet dignity. "It was beautiful once," Margaret whispered. "It still is," Caleb answered. Daniel hesitated. "Most people just see another abandoned building." Caleb smiled faintly. "Old things usually recognize each other." The mayor unlocked the heavy front doors. Dust floated through shafts of afternoon sunlight. Thousands of forgotten books still lined towering shelves. A massive wooden bookcase stood against the west wall, reaching almost to the ceiling. Something about it immediately caught Caleb's attention. Not because it looked unusual, because it somehow looked untouched, as if every other part of the library had surrendered to time, except that single bookcase. Daniel noticed Caleb staring. "Funny," he said. "Everyone asks about that shelf." "What is it?" "No one knows." The mayor shrugged. "It has never moved in my lifetime." Caleb slowly stepped toward it, without understanding why he rested one weathered hand against the cool oak wood. For just a moment. He could have sworn the wood felt warm beneath his fingertips. He quickly pulled his hand away. Perhaps it was only the afternoon sun, or perhaps the forgotten library had already begun waiting for him. Caleb Snyder woke to the unfamiliar silence of the old library long before dawn. For a moment he forgot where he was. He reached instinctively toward the nightstand that had stood beside his bed for more than 30 years, expecting to find his reading glasses and the little brass alarm clock Margaret had bought him on their 10th anniversary. Instead, his hand brushed against the rough wooden surface of a folding table the mayor had loaned them. Reality settled over him once again. They no longer had a bedroom. They no longer had a home. Only the abandoned Carnegie Library that smelled faintly of old paper cedar and rain-soaked stone. Across the room, Margaret was already awake. She sat wrapped in a wool blanket beside the small cast-iron stove, carefully stirring oatmeal inside a dented saucepan. Soft morning light filtered through the tall, arched windows, illuminating tiny specks of dust that drifted lazily through the air like forgotten memories. She smiled when she noticed Caleb watching. "I found another box of dishes in the storage closet." "You already started exploring." "I couldn't sleep." Neither of them admitted the real reason. Grief rarely slept. They ate breakfast in silence at an old reading table scarred by decades of students' initials carved into its edges. Caleb traced one set of carved letters with his fingertip. JM plus LT. Someone perhaps 50 years earlier had believed their love would last forever. He wondered if they had been right. Margaret noticed his expression. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Imagine the lives of strangers." Caleb smiled faintly. "I suppose old habits never disappear." "They're the reason people trusted you." After breakfast, they began cleaning the first floor in earnest. The library had been abandoned for nearly 12 years, but it wasn't destroyed. It felt paused, as though everyone had simply walked away one afternoon, expecting to return the next morning. Old checkout cards still rested inside countless books. Pencils remained inside desk drawers. A calendar hanging behind the circulation desk still displayed April. 12 Aprils ago. Cobwebs stretched across forgotten lamps. Leaves had blown through cracked windows. Rain stains marked portions of the ceiling. Yet the building retained an unusual sense of dignity. It did not feel haunted. It felt patient. By mid-morning, Mayor Daniel Harper returned carrying fresh groceries, blankets, and several boxes of donated supplies from townspeople. "I wasn't sure what you'd need." Margaret looked genuinely touched. "You've already done more than enough." Daniel shook his head. "No." He glanced around the library. "This place deserves company again." Caleb thanked him while unloading canned soup-bread coffee flashlights and extra firewood. Before leaving, Daniel paused beside the massive bookcase along the west wall. "You still looking at this old thing?" Caleb nodded. "Something about it bothers me." Daniel laughed softly. "You're not the first." "What do you mean? When I was a kid, people used to invent stories about this shelf." "What kind of stories?" Daniel leaned against a nearby table. My grandmother swore the library protected its own secrets. Margaret smiled politely. And did you believe her? When I was 10, he chuckled. Absolutely. What happened? I grew up. Daniel shrugged. Turns out most mysteries become plumbing problems or bad architecture. Caleb looked back toward the enormous oak shelves. Perhaps Daniel was right. Old buildings shifted, wood expanded, foundations settled. Still, the shelf didn't seem merely old. It seemed important. As the mayor prepared to leave, he hesitated. There is one strange thing. Caleb looked up. The security company disconnected their system years ago. So, even after that, Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. People occasionally reported hearing noises after midnight. What kind of noises? Nothing dramatic. He smiled awkwardly. Books falling. Footsteps. A door opening. Margaret laughed gently. Old buildings make noises. They do, Daniel nodded. That's exactly what I tell everyone. He climbed into his truck and drove away. Neither Caleb nor Margaret spoke for several moments afterward. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. You don't believe in ghosts? No. But, Caleb looked around the enormous reading room. I do believe buildings remember people. Margaret tilted her head. What does that mean? I don't know. He smiled apologetically. I suppose it doesn't make much sense. It makes sense to me. She squeezed his hand. Some places carry love? The afternoon passed peacefully. Caleb repaired loose window frames while Margaret organized shelves covered in years of dust. Occasionally they found forgotten treasures tucked inside returned books, pressed flowers, children's drawings, old library cards, receipts from restaurants that no longer existed. One novel contained a handwritten note dated 1989. To whoever borrows this next, I hope life becomes kinder before you finish reading. Caleb folded the note carefully and slipped it back inside the book. It already has, he whispered. As evening settled across Ash Grove, rain clouds gathered over the surrounding farmland. Wind rattled branches against the library's tall windows. Margaret prepared vegetable soup over the wood stove, while Caleb lit several oil lamps throughout the reading room. Electricity reached only portions of the building. Most rooms remained wrapped in soft, amber shadows. Surprisingly, neither found the darkness frightening. It felt comforting. After dinner, they settled into two worn leather chairs beside the fireplace. Margaret selected an old novel from one of the shelves. Caleb chose a local history book. Hours passed quietly. Outside rain began falling against the stone walls. Inside, only the crackling fire disturbed the silence. At exactly 11:47, Caleb noticed something unusual. The grandfather clock near the circulation desk had stopped years ago. Its hands permanently pointed toward 4:18. Yet, he distinctly heard it chime once. He looked up. The clock hadn't moved. Margaret lowered her book. You heard that? I thought I imagined it. Neither spoke. The library became still once again. Perhaps the sound had come from somewhere outside. Perhaps another clock in town had carried across the wind. They returned to reading. Midnight arrived. Nothing happened. Caleb almost laughed at himself. Daniel's childhood stories had clearly worked their way into his imagination. He stood stretched his stiff back and began extinguishing several lamps. I'm heading to bed. Margaret smiled. I'll be right behind you. He had taken only 3 steps toward the staircase when creak. The sound froze him in place. Not loud, not violent, slow, heavy, like ancient wood sliding against ancient stone. Margaret stood immediately. Caleb. I hear it. Both turned towards the west wall. The massive oak bookcase stood exactly where it had all day, perfectly still. Caleb frowned. Maybe one of the windows. Then it happened, with impossible slowness. The enormous bookcase shifted. Not much, only an inch, but it moved. Neither wind nor vibration could have caused something so large to slide effortlessly across the stone floor. Margaret gripped Caleb's arm. "Did you see that?" Before he could answer, the bookcase moved again. Another inch, then another. No grinding, no scraping, only the low groan of hidden mechanisms awakening after decades of silence. A narrow black opening appeared behind the shelves. Cold air drifted from the darkness. Not the damp chill of a basement. Something older, cooler, like air trapped underground for generations. Caleb's heartbeat thundered inside his chest. Every rational explanation fought against what his eyes were witnessing. Hidden tracks. Counterweights. An old maintenance passage. There had to be an explanation. There must be some kind of mechanism, he whispered. Margaret nodded nervously. "Don't go alone." Caleb picked up an oil lantern. Its warm light barely reached the growing darkness beyond the opening. The bookcase stopped moving. The hidden passage now stood just wide enough for a person to enter sideways. Neither Caleb nor Margaret crossed the threshold. Not yet. Instead, Caleb slowly lifted the lantern higher. Its golden light revealed rough stone steps descending beneath the library. No treasure, no elaborate chamber, only stairs disappearing into darkness. Then, something caught the edge of the lantern's glow. A small wooden sign hung just inside the entrance, covered in dust. Its faded handwritten words had survived the decades. Caleb gently brushed away the dirt with trembling fingers. Margaret leaned closer. Together they read the inscription. "If you have entered for greed..." The sentence stopped. The remaining words disappeared into the darkness below, beyond the reach of the lantern. Caleb exchanged a long, uncertain glance with Margaret. Neither of them realized it yet. But the first step they were about to take would lead them not toward hidden wealth, but toward a truth an entire town had spent generations trying to forget. The words lingered in the air long after Caleb lowered the lantern. "If you have entered for greed." The unfinished sentence felt strangely deliberate, as though whoever had written it understood that curiosity could be just as powerful as fear. Margaret instinctively tightened her grip on Caleb's sleeve. "We don't have to go down tonight." Caleb stared into the darkness beneath the library. Every sensible instinct told him to wait until morning. They could call Mayor Daniel Harper, ask whether he knew about the hidden chamber. Perhaps there were old blueprints somewhere. Perhaps there was a perfectly ordinary explanation. Yet another feeling, quieter but stronger, settled inside him. If this place had remained hidden for decades, waiting a few more hours would change nothing. "We'll only look," Caleb said softly. "No exploring. No touching anything. If it isn't safe, we come right back." Margaret searched his face for several seconds before nodding. "Together. Always." Caleb lifted the oil lantern higher and stepped through the narrow opening. The temperature dropped immediately. Not dramatically, but enough that goosebumps spread across his arms. The stone staircase descended in a gentle curve, disappearing beneath the original foundation of the century-old Carnegie Library. Each step had been carved from limestone worn smooth by countless feet. That detail caught Caleb's attention. This passage had not been built as a secret escape route used only once or twice. Many people had walked these stairs. Many. Yet somehow the town had forgotten they existed. Or perhaps someone had wanted them forgotten. The couple descended, slowly. Their footsteps echoed softly through the tunnel. The deeper they went, the stronger another scent replaced the smell of damp stone. Old paper, leather, ink, not decay, preservation. At the bottom of the staircase stood a heavy oak door reinforced with black iron straps. Unlike everything upstairs, the door showed remarkably little damage from age. Someone had cared for it. Above the handle hung the rest of the unfinished message. Caleb brushed away another layer of dust. The complete inscription read, "If you have entered for greed, turn back now. If you have entered for truth, welcome." Neither spoke. Margaret looked at Caleb. "I don't think we're here for greed." He smiled gently. "I hope not." The iron latch turned with surprising ease. The door opened inward without resistance. The lantern light spilled across a room unlike anything either of them had imagined. Shelves. Hundreds of shelves, floor to ceiling, stretching farther into the underground chamber than the lantern could illuminate. Every shelf overflowed with carefully organized boxes, journals, leather-bound ledgers, rolled maps, framed photographs, newspaper bundles tied with fading ribbon, and thousands of handwritten documents. Not treasure, not gold, not hidden wealth. Memory. Someone had hidden an entire lifetime of memory beneath the library. Margaret slowly covered her mouth. "Oh." It was all she could manage. Caleb stood completely still. He had expected perhaps an old maintenance room, a forgotten furnace, maybe a Prohibition-era storage cellar. Instead, he found what appeared to be an underground archive, a perfectly preserved archive. The air felt unusually dry. Small vents near the ceiling quietly circulated fresh air, simple but ingenious. Whoever built this place had understood exactly how to protect paper from moisture. Caleb walked carefully between the first rows of shelves. Nothing appeared random. Every box carried handwritten labels. Town council, veterans, school records, farm families, newspapers, library programs, scholarships. Margaret picked up one photograph resting inside an open archival box. The black and white image showed dozens of smiling children sitting on the front steps of the library. Many held books against their chests. Behind them stood a woman in a modest, long dress. She appeared to be in her early 40s, dark hair pinned neatly beneath a small hat. Gentle eyes, confident posture. Someone had written beneath the photograph, "Summer reading celebration, Miss Clara Whitmore." Margaret turned the picture over. "Who's Clara Whitmore?" Caleb shook his head. "I've never heard the name." He looked around again, awed. For someone apparently important enough to appear in so many photographs. Her name meant nothing. On a nearby table rested several leather journals stacked neatly beside an old brass desk lamp. The electricity no longer worked, but the journals remained untouched. Caleb opened the first volume carefully. The first page contained elegant handwriting. January 6th, 1958. If anyone is reading these words, then the library has survived longer than I ever dared hope. Margaret whispered, "This is her." Caleb continued reading. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I have served as librarian in Ashgrove for 27 years. If these journals have been found, then history has finally chosen honesty over convenience." Caleb exchanged another glance with Margaret. Convenience. What did that mean? He turned the page. The journal did not begin with dramatic secrets. Instead, it described ordinary days. Children borrowing adventure novels, farmers reading agricultural manuals during winter evenings, widows attending weekly sewing circles, veterans studying for college entrance exams after returning home from war. Again and again, one message emerged. The library had once been the heart of Ashgrove. Not merely a building, a refuge, a classroom, a gathering place, a second home. Margaret smiled sadly. My grandmother used to tell stories like this. So did mine. Caleb nodded. Small-town libraries used to keep communities together. He turned another page. The tone changed. March 18th, 1961. Mr. Holloway attended today's council meeting again. He says books cannot compete with progress. He speaks often about profit, rarely about people. Caleb frowned. Holloway. Margaret looked up. That's the same family as Richard Holloway. The wealthy developer. The man Daniel had briefly mentioned while discussing the library's uncertain future. Caleb continued reading. Each passing journal grew heavier, more urgent. Clara described growing pressure from several influential businessmen who believed the library occupied valuable land better suited for commercial development. Funding disappeared. Programs were canceled. Staff positions were eliminated. Historical records mysteriously vanished from public files. Newspaper articles praising the library stopped appearing. Then came another entry. October 2nd, 1963. Today they removed 27 boxes from the town archive. Officially, they were duplicates. They were not duplicates. They were proof. Proof of what Caleb flipped forward impatiently. The next several pages had been marked with tiny slips of paper. Someone had wanted future readers to notice them. Inside lay copies of old newspaper articles, property records, donation lists, photographs, letters. One document immediately caught Caleb's eye. A large map of Ash Grove from nearly 70 years earlier. Entire neighborhoods shown on the old map no longer existed. Churches had disappeared. Schools had vanished. Even street names had changed. Margaret leaned closer. "It's like another town." Or, Caleb whispered, another version of this town. He carefully rolled the map closed again. The deeper they explored, the clearer one truth became. Nothing here had been hidden accidentally. Someone had spent years preserving every document with extraordinary care. Boxes had been organized chronologically, letters wrapped in acid-free paper, photographs stored inside protective sleeves. Even the journals rested inside handmade cloth covers. Whoever maintained the archive had expected it to remain hidden for generations. Suddenly, Margaret stopped walking. "Caleb." He turned. She pointed toward the far corner of the chamber. There stood a small wooden writing desk. Unlike everything else, it looked as though someone had stood up from it only yesterday. An ink bottle, a fountain pen, reading glasses, a neatly folded cardigan draped over the chair. Dust covered everything. Yet the arrangement felt deeply personal, almost sacred. On the desktop rested one final journal. Unlike the others, it had never been tied shut. Caleb opened it gently. Only one page contained writing. Just one. The handwriting appeared weaker than before, more fragile. "If you have reached this desk, then I failed." They succeeded in making the town forget. But perhaps they could not make it forget forever. Signed simply, Clara. Margaret quietly wiped tears from her eyes. She knew. Knew what? That someday someone else would finish what she couldn't. Caleb slowly closed the journal. His chest tightened with emotions he couldn't fully explain. He had never met Clara Whitmore, yet standing inside her hidden archive, he felt as though he already understood her. She had spent years protecting stories no one wanted to remember. Not because they made her wealthy, not because anyone thanked her, but because she believed forgotten people deserved to be remembered. Caleb looked around the immense underground chamber once more. Hundreds of boxes, thousands of documents, entire lives waiting patiently beneath the library. He suddenly realized something that sent a chill through him. If even half of these records contained the truth Clara hinted at, then someone above ground had spent decades making sure no one ever found them. And if those people or their descendants were still protecting those secrets, Caleb and Margaret had just become the first outsiders in generations to discover exactly what they had worked so hard to bury. Caleb did not sleep that night. Even after they climbed back up the stone stairs and carefully pulled the bookcase closed behind them, the weight of what they had seen refused to loosen its grip on his mind. The library above felt different now. Not abandoned, not forgotten. Guarded. Margaret lay beside him on the narrow cot they had set up between two long reading tables. Her breathing eventually settled into a slow, steady rhythm, but Caleb could tell she wasn't truly asleep. Every so often, her fingers would curl slightly, as though she were still holding on to something invisible, something fragile that might slip away if she relaxed too much. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a deep, unnatural stillness. Caleb stared up at the high ceiling, tracing the faint outlines of wooden beams barely visible in the dim lamplight. His thoughts circled endlessly around the same questions. Who was Clara Whitmore, really? What had she been trying to protect? And more importantly, who had been trying to erase her? By the time morning light crept through the tall, arched windows, Caleb had already made a decision. He just didn't know how to say it out loud. Margaret sat up slowly, wrapping her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. You didn't sleep. Neither did you. She gave a faint, knowing smile. What are you thinking? Caleb hesitated. Then quietly, we can't ignore this. Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked around the vast reading room, her gaze lingering on the towering shelves, the dusty tables, the quiet dignity of a place that had once held so much life. This wasn't meant to be found, she said softly. I think it was. Caleb met her eyes. Just not by the wrong people. Margaret exhaled slowly. And how do we know we're not the wrong people? That question lingered between them. Caleb didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the west wall and rested his hand lightly against the bookcase once more. The wood felt cool this time, lifeless, as though the secret beneath it had retreated back into silence. We didn't go down there for money, he said finally. Margaret followed him, standing close enough that their shoulders touched. No, we didn't go looking for anything at all. She nodded. Then why does it feel like we found something we weren't supposed to see? Caleb's jaw tightened slightly, because someone worked very hard to make sure no one ever would. The words settled heavily in the air. Margaret looked away. I don't want trouble, Caleb. I know. We just lost everything. I know. Her voice trembled just slightly. I don't think I can lose anything else. That was the moment Caleb understood what she truly meant. It wasn't the house. It wasn't their belongings. It was safety. Trust. The fragile sense that the world, even after everything Ryan had done, still had some small corner where they could exist without being hurt again. Caleb reached for her hand. We won't rush anything, he said gently. We'll be careful. Margaret searched his face. You promise, I promise. She nodded, though uncertainty still lingered in her eyes. Then we move slowly, together. Always. Later that morning, Caleb made a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with. He walked into town. Ashgrove's main street was quiet, lined with small businesses that looked as though they had been slowly fading for years, rather than failing all at once. A diner, a hardware store, a pharmacy that doubled as a general shop. People noticed him immediately. Not because he did anything unusual, because he was new. Small towns didn't ignore unfamiliar faces. They studied them, measured them, decided often silently whether they belonged. Caleb felt those eyes as he stepped into the diner. The conversation inside didn't stop, but it shifted. Voices lowered, glances lingered. He took a seat at the counter. A waitress in her late 50s approached, offering a polite but guarded smile. Coffee. Yes, ma'am. She poured without asking anything else. For a few minutes, Caleb simply sat there, listening. Farm prices, weather patterns, a broken tractor, ordinary conversations, normal life. The kind of life that had been taken from him so quickly, it still felt unreal. Finally, a man sitting 2 stools away spoke. You're the one staying at the old library. It wasn't a question. Caleb nodded. That's right. The man turned slightly, revealing a weathered face and sharp blue eyes. You planning to fix it up? Just cleaning for now. The man studied him. Most people don't stay long in that place. Why's that? A faint smile crossed the man's lips. Too quiet? Caleb almost laughed. Quiet doesn't bother me. The man's smile faded. It should. Before Caleb could respond, the waitress returned. You here for work or just passing through neither? He hesitated. Just needed a place to land for a while. She softened slightly. Life has a way of pushing people around. That it does. The man beside him spoke again. You notice anything strange, yet Caleb kept his expression neutral, like what the man shrugged. Depends who you ask. Some say the place is just old. Others say it remembers things it shouldn't. Caleb felt a slow tightening in his chest. Things like what the man didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked a different question. You ever heard of Clara Whitmore? The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Caleb kept his voice steady. No. The man studied him carefully. Most people haven't. Why not? The man leaned back slightly. Because people like her tend to disappear. Disappear how the man's eyes flicked briefly toward the other diners. Depends on who you ask. Caleb waited. But the man said nothing more. The silence stretched long enough that Caleb finally looked away. When he turned back, the man was gone. No goodbye, no explanation, just an empty stool. Caleb frowned. That was strange. The waitress followed his gaze. Who the man sitting there? She blinked. There hasn't been anyone sitting there since you came in. Caleb's heartbeat skipped. That's not possible. She gave him a puzzled look. You've been talking to yourself for the past 10 minutes. A chill ran through him. He turned slowly, scanning the diner. No one looked surprised. No one looked concerned. Just quiet curiosity. The kind people reserved for someone they weren't quite sure about. Caleb forced a small smile. Must have been thinking out loud. The waitress nodded politely. It happens. But Caleb knew better. He hadn't imagined that conversation. The man had been real, hadn't he? As Caleb stepped back outside into the late morning sun, the world felt slightly off balance. Not dramatically. Just enough that he couldn't ignore it. The town, the library, the hidden archive. And now, a name no one seemed to remember. Clara Whitmore. Caleb stood on the quiet street, staring back toward the distant outline of the library at the edge of town. For the first time since arriving, he felt something new rising beneath the grief, beneath the betrayal. Not fear. Not yet. Something sharper, something steadier. Determination. Because whatever had been hidden beneath that library, whatever truth Clara had protected, it wasn't just history. It was something someone still didn't want found. And now, whether he liked it or not, Caleb Snyder had become part of that story. Caleb walked back to the library with a strange heaviness pressing against his chest. The morning sun had risen high over Ashgrove, casting long shadows across the quiet road leading towards the abandoned building. From a distance, the library looked unchanged, still dignified, almost forgotten. But Caleb no longer saw it that way. Now he saw layers. What stood above ground was only half the truth. Margaret was waiting for him on the front steps when he arrived. She had swept the entrance clean and placed 2 old chairs near the doorway, as if reclaiming a small piece of dignity from the ruins. She stood the moment she saw his face. What happened? Caleb hesitated before answering. I went to the diner. And he sat down slowly, removing his hat, running a tired hand through his gray hair. I asked about Clara Whitmore. Margaret's expression tightened, and no one remembers her. She didn't look surprised. That's what you expected, isn't it? Caleb shook his head. No, not like this. He leaned forward slightly. I spoke to a man. He knew her name, said people like her disappear. Margaret frowned, and then Caleb paused. Then he was gone. Gone how? He was just not there anymore. Margaret studied him carefully. Caleb. I know what it sounds like. You think you imagined him. Caleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked back toward the library doors behind them. I don't know what to think. Margaret sat beside him. For now, we don't assume anything strange. That might be difficult. We stick to facts. She placed her hand over his. We found a hidden archive. Yes. It belongs to someone named Clara Whitmore. Yes. And someone wanted it hidden. Caleb nodded. Those are the facts. Margaret took a slow breath. Then we start there. Caleb looked at her surprised. You want to go back down? Her eyes were steady now. We said we wouldn't rush. We won't. But we also said we wouldn't ignore it. She squeezed his hand. Let's understand what we're dealing with. Something in her voice reassured him. Not certainty, but courage. Quiet, steady courage. They entered the library together. The building felt different in daylight, less mysterious, more grounded. The long shadows of night had been replaced by warm sunlight, streaming through the tall windows, illuminating shelves that now looked less ominous and more inviting. Still, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something beneath the surface was watching, not in a threatening way, in a waiting way. They approached the west wall again. The bookcase stood exactly as it had before. Still, silent, unmoving. Margaret crossed her arms. It's just a shelf in the daylight. Caleb nodded. Last night didn't feel like that. He reached out and placed his hand on the wood again. Nothing happened. He pushed gently. It didn't move. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Maybe it only opens at night. Or maybe we imagined everything. They both knew that wasn't true. Caleb stepped back. Let's wait. For midnight, he nodded. If there's a pattern, we need to see it. Margaret agreed. Until then, they focused on something simpler. They continued cleaning. But this time, their work carried new purpose. Every shelf they dusted, every book they straightened, every drawer they opened felt like uncovering fragments of a larger story. In the early afternoon, Margaret discovered a locked cabinet behind the circulation desk. It wasn't large. Old metal, rust along the hinges. Caleb. He joined her. Locked. Yes. He examined it briefly. Probably hasn't been opened in years. Margaret stepped aside. Try it. Caleb searched through a nearby drawer and found a ring of old keys left behind by whoever last managed the building. Most were labeled. Storage, office, basement. One key had no label at all. Just plain brass. He tried it. It fit. The lock clicked open with surprising ease. Margaret leaned closer as he pulled the cabinet door open. Inside were dozens of thin folders, each labeled carefully. Names. Dozens of names. Some marked with dates, others with notes written in neat, precise handwriting. Margaret picked one at random. Samuel Carter. She opened the folder. Inside were documents. Old library records, application forms, letters. A handwritten note clipped to the front. Scholarship approved. Margaret's voice softened. This looks like help. Caleb nodded slowly. People came here for more than books. They opened another folder. Lydia Barnes. Inside, medical assistance forms. Letters from a local doctor. A receipt marked paid. Margaret looked up. The library helped pay for treatment. Caleb's chest tightened. They weren't just lending books. They were saving lives. They opened more folders. A pattern emerged. Families in crisis. Students needing tuition. Veterans adjusting to civilian life. Widows struggling to survive. Each folder told a story, not of charity, but of quiet support. Carefully organized, privately given. No recognition, no announcements, just help. Margaret closed one folder gently. This place was a lifeline. Caleb nodded, and someone tried to erase that. He leaned back against the desk, deep in thought. If Clara Whitmore was behind this. Margaret finished his sentence. Then she wasn't just a librarian. She was protecting people. A long silence followed. Then Margaret spoke again. We can't keep this to ourselves. Caleb looked at her sharply. You want to tell the town? Not everything. Not yet. But pieces. He hesitated. You saw how they reacted at the diner. They don't trust what they don't understand. Margaret nodded. Then we don't ask them to understand everything. We show them something real. She held up one of the folders. Stories like this. Caleb considered it. It was risky, but it was also right. If we share too much too soon... We don't, she said firmly. We start small. With truth. Caleb let out a slow breath. You've always been the braver one. Margaret smiled faintly. No, I've just always known when something matters. She looked around the library. This matters. Caleb followed her gaze. For the first time since arriving, he felt something shift inside him. Not just grief, not just loss, purpose. A quiet, growing purpose. They spent the rest of the afternoon selecting a few stories. Nothing too revealing. Just enough to show the library's impact. Names, faces, proof that the building had once meant something. As evening approached, Caleb stepped outside again. The sun was setting behind the fields, painting the sky in deep orange and soft purple. The town looked peaceful, unchanged. But Caleb knew better. Something had already begun. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a story waiting to be told. Behind him inside the library, Margaret arranged the selected folders neatly on the front desk, preparing, not for confrontation, but for truth. And somewhere beneath their feet, in the hidden archive that had waited for decades, the past remained exactly where it had always been, watching, waiting, for someone brave enough to finally bring it back into the light. That evening, the library felt less like a shelter and more like a threshold. Caleb noticed it the moment the sun dipped below the horizon. The light inside the building shifted from warm gold to deep amber, then slowly to shadow. The silence thickened, not empty, but full, like a room waiting for a question to be asked. Margaret finished arranging the folders they had chosen to share. She placed them neatly on the front desk, smoothing the edges, as if preparing something sacred rather than simple documents. "Are you sure about tomorrow?" Caleb asked. She didn't look up. "No." He smiled faintly. "Good. That makes two of us." Margaret finally met his eyes. "But I am sure about this," she said, tapping lightly on the stack of folders. "These people existed. Their stories matter." Caleb nodded slowly. "And if someone tried to erase them, then we give them back their place." He took a deep breath. "All right?" A long pause settled between them. Then Caleb turned toward the west wall. "Midnight?" Margaret followed his gaze. "We're going back down." He didn't phrase it as a question. She didn't treat it like one. They spent the next few hours in quiet preparation. Not dramatic, not fearful, just careful. Caleb checked the lanterns, refilling oil and trimming wicks. Margaret packed a small bag with water, a blanket, and a notebook. Something about writing things down made the unknown feel more manageable. By the time the clock in Caleb's mind reached midnight, the outside world had gone completely still. No cars, no voices, no wind, only the soft creak of the building settling into the night. They stood together in front of the bookcase. It looked ordinary again, heavy, unmoving. Margaret folded her arms, same as before. Caleb nodded. "Give it a minute." They waited. Seconds stretched into a full minute, then 2, then 3. Nothing. Margaret exhaled quietly. Maybe it doesn't happen every night. Caleb frowned slightly. It happened exactly at midnight yesterday. Maybe that was coincidence. He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer, studying the wood carefully. His fingers traced the edges of the frame, feeling for seams, hinges, anything that might explain the mechanism. Still nothing. Margaret checked her watch. 12:04. Caleb stepped back. "Let's wait a little longer." They sat in the chairs near the entrance lantern light, flickering softly between them. The library seemed almost disappointed, as though it had expected them to give up sooner. At 12:11, a sound. Not from the bookcase. From behind them, both turned instantly. The front doors. A faint, deliberate knock echoed through the empty building. Once. Then silence. Caleb stood immediately. Margaret grabbed his arm. "Don't open it. It could be someone from town." At midnight, another knock. Softer this time, but unmistakable. Caleb hesitated. Every instinct told him Margaret was right. But another part of him, the same part that had led him down into the hidden archive, refused to ignore it. "I'll just check," he said. Margaret didn't let go. "Be careful." He nodded. The walk to the front doors felt longer than it should have. Each step echoed louder than the last, as though the building itself was listening. He reached the door, paused, then slowly opened it. Outside, nothing. No car, no person, no movement. Just the quiet road and a stretch of empty darkness. Caleb stepped onto the porch, scanning the surroundings. Hello, no answer. He turned back towards Margaret. "There's no one, Kriak!" The sound cut through his sentence. Both froze. The bookcase. It was moving. Again. Slower than before. More deliberate. As though something had been waiting for them to look away. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "It didn't open when we were watching." Caleb stepped back inside, closing the door behind him. It wanted us distracted. The realization settled uneasily between them. They approached the west wall together. The opening was wider this time, much wider. Wide enough to walk through without turning sideways. Margaret's grip on his arm tightened. "This feels different." "It is." Caleb lifted the lantern. The staircase below looked the same, but the air colder, heavier, as if something deeper had been revealed. They descended again slower than the night before. Every step carried more weight, more awareness. At the bottom, the door stood slightly ajar. It hadn't been left that way. Caleb was certain of it. He pushed it open carefully. The archive beyond remained intact, unchanged. Boxes still lined the shelves. Journals remained stacked neatly. The desk in the corner looked exactly as it had before, yet something felt shifted. Margaret noticed it too. "It's quieter." Caleb frowned. It was already quiet. "No," she said softly. "Not like this." She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room. "It feels like something's missing." Caleb moved toward the desk again. The final journal still lay where he had left it, but something new rested beside it. A single envelope. Plain. Unmarked. It hadn't been there before. Margaret's voice trembled slightly. "Was that here yesterday?" Caleb shook his head. "No." He picked it up carefully. The paper felt dry, old, but not fragile, as though it had been preserved deliberately. Margaret stepped closer. "Open it." Caleb hesitated. For the first time since discovering the archive, doubt crept into his mind. Not fear of the unknown, but the weight of stepping further into something he couldn't fully understand. What if this changes everything he asked quietly? Margaret didn't hesitate. It already has. He nodded. Slowly he opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Clara Whitmore. Caleb unfolded it carefully. The ink had faded slightly with time, but every word remained legible. He began to read aloud. "If you are holding this letter, then you have gone farther than anyone was ever meant to." Margaret's breath caught. Caleb continued, "I did not leave this for the curious. I left it for the persistent, for those who refuse to turn away." He swallowed, his voice tightening. "If you have found this, then the archive has chosen you," Margaret whispered. "Chosen us." Caleb read on. "There are truths here that will not be welcomed. There are names that will not be forgiven. And there are people who will do anything to keep these pages buried." The air in the room seemed to grow colder. Caleb's hands tightened around the letter. "This is not history alone. This is proof." Margaret looked up sharply. Proof of what Caleb continued reading. Proof of what was taken. Proof of who took it. Proof of how an entire town was rewritten. Silence filled the archive. Heavy, unavoidable. Caleb lowered the letter slowly. Margaret stared at him. "This isn't just about the past." "No," Caleb said quietly. "It never was." He looked around the room again, at the shelves, the boxes, the carefully preserved lives, and suddenly Everything felt clearer. Clara Whitmore hadn't just hidden memories, she had hidden evidence, and now that evidence was no longer hidden. Margaret took a slow step back. We can't pretend this is small anymore. Caleb shook his head. No. Then what do we do? He looked at the letter again, at the words that had survived decades in silence, at the truth that had waited patiently beneath the surface. Finally, he spoke. We finish what she started. Margaret didn't respond right away. Then quietly, even if it costs us everything. Caleb met her eyes. It already did. A long silence followed. Then Margaret nodded. Then we don't stop. Above them the library stood as it always had. Still, quiet, unchanged. But below everything had just shifted, because the truth was no longer buried. And once truth begins to rise, there is no force strong enough to push it back down. The next morning did not arrive with clarity. It arrived with tension. Caleb felt it the moment he stepped outside the library. The air in Ashgrove carried something heavier than the quiet calm of previous days. It wasn't loud. No one was shouting. No alarms rang. But something had shifted. People were watching. Not casually this time. Deliberately. From porches. From parked trucks. From behind the windows of the small businesses lining Main Street. Margaret noticed it too as she joined him. They know, she said quietly. Caleb didn't ask how. He already felt it. Word had spread, but not from them, which meant something else. Something or someone had noticed. We move forward anyway, Caleb said. Margaret nodded, though her grip on his arm tightened just slightly. Inside the library, the stack of selected folders remained exactly where they had left them, on the front desk. Simple stories. Carefully chosen. Not the most dangerous truths, not the deepest secrets. Just enough to begin. Margaret straightened the top folder again. We start with one. Caleb nodded. Just one. They didn't have to wait long. By mid-morning, the first visitor arrived. Emily Brooks. Caleb recognized her from town, a woman in her early 30s with sharp eyes and the kind of posture that suggested she carried more responsibility than she let on. A teacher. That much was obvious. She stepped into the library slowly, her gaze moving across the room with quiet reverence. I heard you were opening this place again. Caleb offered a small smile. Not opening. Just taking care of it. Emily nodded, though she didn't look convinced. Her eyes landed on the folders. What's that? Margaret stepped forward. Something we found. Emily approached carefully. What kind of something? Caleb hesitated. Then made a decision. History? Emily let out a soft breath, whose history Margaret picked up the top folder and handed it to her. Open it. Emily glanced between them before doing so. Inside. The story of Samuel Carter, a young man from Ashgrove, 1962. Rejected from college, working 2 jobs, almost giving up, until a handwritten note. Scholarship approved. Emily read silently for several moments. Then she flipped through the documents. Letters, receipts, proof. Her expression changed. This is real. Yes, Caleb said. Emily looked up. Why hasn't anyone ever heard of this? Caleb didn't answer. He didn't need to. Emily understood. Her voice dropped. Someone hid this. Margaret nodded gently. For a long time. Emily closed the folder carefully, almost reverently. How much of this do you have? Caleb exchanged a glance with Margaret. Enough. Emily studied them both. You realize what this means? Caleb nodded. We're starting to. Emily stepped back slightly, processing. This town, the way it tells its story. She shook her head. It's incomplete. More than incomplete, Caleb said quietly. It's been changed. Emily looked toward the shelves. Who did this? Caleb's voice remained calm. That's what we're still learning. Before Emily could respond, the front doors opened again. This time, not gently. Richard Holloway stepped inside, tall, well-dressed, confident in the way only someone used to control could be. Behind him stood two other men, not locals, lawyers. Emily stiffened immediately. Caleb felt Margaret's hand tighten around his. Richard's gaze moved slowly across the room, then settled on the folders. So he said, voice smooth but cold. It's true. No greeting, no introduction, just assumption. Caleb stepped forward slightly. What's true? Richard smiled faintly. That you've decided to play historian. Emily spoke before Caleb could respond. They found something important. Richard didn't look at her. His eyes remained locked on Caleb. They found something inconvenient. Margaret stepped forward now. Inconvenient for who Richard finally shifted his attention. For anyone who understands how fragile a community really is. Caleb's jaw tightened. You mean how easily it can be controlled? Richard's smile didn't falter. I mean how easily it can be damaged. He gestured toward the folder in Emily's hands. Stories like that don't help anyone now. Emily's voice sharpened. They help people understand the truth. Richard turned to her slowly. And what do you think happens when truth disrupts stability? Emily didn't hesitate. Then the stability was never real. A flicker of irritation crossed Richard's face, brief, controlled, but visible. He turned back to Caleb. You're new here. That's right. You don't understand how things work in Ashgrove. Caleb met his gaze. I understand enough. Richard took a step closer. Then understand this. His voice dropped slightly. That building is scheduled for demolition. Margaret spoke firmly. Not yet. Richard smiled. Soon. Emily stepped forward. You can't just erase this. Richard finally looked directly at her. I'm not erasing anything. He paused. I'm preserving what matters. Caleb shook his head. No, you're protecting what benefits you. Silence fell. Heavy. Tense. The two men behind Richard shifted slightly as though preparing for escalation, but Richard simply studied Caleb. Long, careful. You're not afraid, he said. Caleb didn't answer. You should be. Margaret stepped beside him. We've already lost everything. Richard's gaze flicked toward her. Then you have more to lose than you realize. The words hung in the air. Not a threat, not openly, but close enough. Emily stepped forward again. You don't get to decide what people know. Richard turned toward her fully now. Don't I? Their eyes locked. A battle without movement, without noise, but undeniable. Finally, Richard exhaled slowly. This conversation isn't productive. He turned back towards the door, but before leaving, he looked once more at Caleb. Be careful what you dig up. His voice was calm, measured, but if you insist on uncovering the past... He paused. Don't be surprised when it reaches back. Then he walked out. The two men followed. The doors closed behind them with a quiet finality. For a long moment, no one spoke. The library seemed to hold its breath. Margaret was the first to break the silence. Well, Emily let out a shaky breath. That was direct. Caleb nodded slowly. He's not worried about the past. Emily looked at him. Then what is he worried about? Caleb's eyes moved toward the stack of folders, then toward the west wall, toward the hidden archive beneath their feet. Proof, he said quietly. Margaret understood immediately. So it's true. Caleb nodded. Everything Clara wrote. Emily looked between them. Clara Caleb met her gaze. The woman who hid all of this. Emily's eyes widened slightly. You know her name? Yes. And someone else doesn't want anyone else to. Silence settled again, but this time it felt different, not uncertain, not hesitant, resolved. Emily straightened her posture. What do you need? Caleb looked at Margaret, then back at Emily. Help. Emily didn't hesitate. You have it. Margaret stepped forward. Then we move carefully. Caleb nodded. But we don't stop. Outside, Ashgrove remained quiet, peaceful on the surface, unchanged. But beneath that calm, something had begun. Lines had been drawn. Truth had been challenged. And for the first time in decades, someone had pushed back. That night, the library did not wait for midnight. Caleb felt it before the clock could confirm it. The air inside the building shifted, tightening with a quiet urgency that seemed to pulse through the walls themselves. The usual calm that had settled each evening since their arrival was gone. In its place was something sharper. Expectation. Margaret sensed it too. She paused in the middle of stacking a set of returned books they had found in a storage crate, her hands hovering mid-air, as though she had just heard something too faint to name. "It's earlier," she whispered. Caleb nodded slowly. "I know." Emily Brooks stood near the front desk, flipping through one of the folders they had shown her earlier. She had stayed longer than planned, her curiosity and growing concern keeping her rooted to the library. "You both look like you're waiting for something," she said, trying to sound light, though her voice carried unease. Caleb met her eyes. "We are," Margaret added quietly, "and you might want to see this." Emily closed the folder. See what before either of them could answer creak. The sound cut through the room, not distant, not subtle, close. All three turned toward the west wall. The bookcase was already moving, not inch by inch like before, but steadily, deliberately, as though whatever mechanism controlled it had grown more confident. Emily froze. That's not possible." Margaret didn't look at her. "Stay close." The opening widened. Cold air spilled into the room stronger than before, carrying that same faint scent of preserved paper and something older beneath it. Caleb grabbed a lantern. "Come with us," he said to Emily. She hesitated, only for a second. Then, okay. They approached together. This time there was no hesitation at the threshold, no pause. Whatever line had once existed between curiosity and commitment, they had already crossed it. The descent felt different with three people. The echoes of their footsteps layered over one another, creating a rhythm that felt almost intentional, as if the passage itself were guiding them downward. At the bottom, the door stood wide open, not just slightly ajar, open, fully. Emily's voice dropped. "Did you leave it like that?" Caleb shook his head. "No." Margaret tightened her grip on the lantern she carried. Something changed. They stepped inside. The archive greeted them in silence. But it was not the same silence as before. Before, it had felt preserved. Now it felt active. Not alive, but awake. Emily turned slowly, taking it all in. "Oh my God." Her voice echoed softly between the shelves. This is an entire hidden record." Caleb nodded. "Decades." Margaret added, "Maybe more." Emily moved toward the nearest shelf, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled out a labeled box. "Town Council Records, 1960 to 1965. She opened it carefully. Inside, documents. Official, stamped, signed. Her eyes widened. "These aren't copies." "No," Caleb said. "They're originals." Emily looked up sharply. "That means whatever version exists above ground might not be real." Margaret finished. Emily closed the box slowly. Someone didn't just hide history. They replaced it. Caleb's gaze moved toward the far end of the room. The letter. Margaret followed his line of sight. The desk, the envelope, still there, unchanged. But something else. A new presence. A second envelope now rested beside the first. Emily noticed it too. "Was that there before?" "No," Caleb said quietly. It wasn't. He approached the desk slowly, each step measured. Margaret stayed close. Emily followed her breath, shallow. Caleb picked up the second envelope. Unlike the first, this one had writing on the front. Not faded, not old, fresh. 3 words. In case they return. Margaret's voice barely rose above a whisper. Caleb, didn't answer. He opened it. Inside. Multiple documents. Not letters. Evidence. Legal documents. Property deeds. Council meeting transcripts. Signed statements. Emily leaned closer, scanning quickly, her face drained of color. These are land transfers. Caleb flipped through them. They're not normal transfers. Margaret stepped closer. What do you mean? Emily pointed to one page. Look at the signatures. Caleb did. Multiple names, some repeated, others crossed out, replaced, dates altered, notations scribbled in margins. This isn't clean, Emily said. It's manipulated. Caleb turned to another document. This one. He stopped. Margaret leaned in. What is it? He handed it to her. A large map. Not like the earlier one. More detailed. Marked with sections of land. Highlighted areas. Ownership boundaries. Margaret traced one section with her finger. This is the library. Emily pointed to another. And this is most of the town. Caleb's voice dropped. It all connects. Emily looked up. Connects how Caleb exhaled slowly. The land. Margaret's eyes widened. You think yes, he said. This isn't just about history, it's about ownership. Emily shook her head. That doesn't make sense. If something like this happened, people would know. Caleb met her gaze. Would they? Silence answered. Margaret looked back at the documents. Clara wasn't just preserving stories, she was protecting proof. Emily stepped back slightly. Proof of what Caleb held up, one of the altered deeds. That land was taken, Margaret added quietly. Emily's voice trembled, and given to who Caleb didn't need to say it. They all already knew. Holloway? Margaret whispered, generations of it. Emily shook her head again, but this time it wasn't denial. It was realization. This town. It wasn't built the way people think. Caleb nodded. It was rewritten. A long silence settled over them. Then a sound above them. Footsteps. All three froze. Margaret's hand tightened around Caleb's arm. Someone's upstairs. Emily's eyes widened. At this hour, Caleb's voice dropped. We're not alone. The footsteps moved slowly, measured, not searching, walking, as if whoever it was knew exactly where they were going. Margaret whispered, They're going to the bookcase. Caleb nodded. They know. Emily's breath quickened. What do we do? Caleb looked around the archive, at the shelves, the documents, the truth that had survived decades underground. Then back at the staircase. We don't panic. Margaret squeezed his hand. We don't hide. Caleb shook his head. No. Emily stared at him. You want to go up there? Caleb's eyes hardened. They already know we're here. Margaret understood immediately. If we run now, they control the story, she finished. Caleb nodded. Emily hesitated. Then, okay. They moved toward the stairs together. Each step upward felt heavier than the last, not because of fear, because of what they carried now. Knowledge. Truth. Proof. At the top, the opening stood wide. The bookcase fully shifted, and beyond it, a silhouette, standing in the dim light of the library. Waiting. Caleb stepped forward first, into the open, into the confrontation, because whatever had been hidden beneath that library for decades was no longer hidden, and whoever had come looking for it had arrived too late. The silhouette did not move. It stood just beyond the opening framed by the dim glow of the library lamps, as if it had been waiting not only for someone to emerge, but for a very specific moment to arrive. Caleb stepped out first. Margaret followed close behind. Emily came last, her breath shallow but steady. As Caleb's eyes adjusted to the light, the figure became clear. Mayor Daniel Harper. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides, not aggressive, not defensive. just still. His expression carried something heavier than anger. Disappointment. Caleb's voice remained calm. You knew. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze drifted past Caleb toward the open bookcase, toward the hidden space beneath the library that was no longer hidden at all. I hoped you wouldn't find it, Daniel said finally. Margaret stepped forward slightly. Or you hoped no one ever would. Daniel's jaw tightened. That place was buried for a reason. Emily's voice sharpened. Because the truth was dangerous. Daniel turned toward her. Because the truth breaks things. Caleb shook his head slowly. No. The truth reveals what's already broken. Silence followed. Heavy. Unavoidable. Daniel exhaled slowly and walked toward the west wall, stopping just short of the open passage. You don't understand what you've uncovered, he said. Caleb met his gaze. Then explain it. Daniel hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. Not fear. Something more complicated. Conflict. Finally, he spoke. My grandfather sat on the town council. Margaret listened closely. He used to say Ashgrove survived because people knew when to let the past go. Emily crossed her arms. That's not survival, that's denial. Daniel's eyes flashed briefly. You think digging this up will fix anything? He gestured toward the open archive. Do you know what happens when people find out their families built their lives on something stolen? Margaret answered quietly. They face it. Daniel shook his head. No, they fall apart. Caleb stepped closer. Or they rebuild honestly. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. You're not from here. No, you didn't grow up with these people. No, you didn't watch this town struggle just to keep itself alive. Caleb didn't back down. And you didn't watch it forget who it was. The words landed harder than anything else that had been said. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly, a crack in his certainty. Emily stepped forward. You knew about Clara Whitmore, didn't you? Daniel didn't respond. That's why no one talks about her. Emily continued, because people like you made sure they wouldn't. Daniel finally spoke, his voice quieter now. She caused chaos. Margaret's eyes narrowed. She told the truth. Daniel looked at her. She exposed things that couldn't be undone. Caleb's voice remained steady. Good. Daniel shook his head again, frustration rising. You think it's that simple? Caleb didn't hesitate. It is. Daniel laughed bitterly. No, it isn't. He gestured toward the town beyond the windows. Everything you see out there, every house, every business rests on stability. And sometimes that stability is built on compromise. Emily's voice cut in sharply. Compromise is not the same as theft. Daniel's eyes hardened. You're young, and you're wrong. The tension in the room tightened again, but this time something shifted. Daniel's anger wasn't aimed outward anymore. It turned inward, toward himself, toward something he had carried for a long time. Caleb noticed it. You didn't come here to stop us, he said quietly. Daniel didn't answer. You came to see if we would go through with it. Margaret looked at him. You've known about this for years. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. When I took office, I found references. Not the archive itself, but hints, mentions of Clara Whitmore, old disputes, records that didn't match. He opened his eyes again. I chose not to look deeper. Emily shook her head. You chose not to see. Daniel didn't argue, because it was true. Caleb stepped closer. And now Daniel looked at the open passage again, at the truth that could no longer be ignored. I don't know. Margaret's voice softened slightly. You do. Daniel looked at her. No, she said gently. You just don't like the answer. A long silence followed. Then a voice from the doorway. You're all making this much harder than it needs to be. Everyone turned. Richard Holloway stepped inside. Alone this time. No lawyers, no backup. Just him. His presence filled the room immediately, controlled, confident, unbothered. He looked from Daniel to Caleb, then to the open bookcase. "Well," he said, "now we're all on the same page." Caleb's expression didn't change. "You shouldn't be here." Richard smiled faintly. "I could say the same." Margaret stepped forward. "This ends now." Richard tilted his head slightly. "No, this begins now." He walked slowly toward the center of the room. "You found something valuable." Emily's voice sharpened. "It's not yours." Richard stopped. "It is now." Caleb's eyes hardened. "You think documents make ownership?" Richard smiled. "They make control." He gestured toward the archive. "You think the town will side with you?" He shook his head. "They won't. They'll side with what keeps their lives intact." Margaret stepped closer to Caleb. "They deserve the truth." Richard looked at her. "People don't want truth. They want comfort." Emily stepped forward. "They want both." Richard laughed quietly. "They can't have both." Caleb spoke calm and unwavering. "They can have honesty." Richard's smile faded slightly. "And what happens when honesty takes everything away?" Caleb didn't hesitate. "Then it was never theirs to begin with." The room fell silent. Richard studied him carefully. "You really believe that?" "Yes." A long pause. Then Richard exhaled slowly. "Then you're going to force this." Caleb met his gaze. "We already have." Richard looked toward Daniel. "And you?" Daniel stood still, caught between two paths, between comfort and truth, between silence and consequence. For a moment it seemed like he might choose the easier side, the safer side, the side he had chosen before. Then he stepped forward, toward Caleb, toward Margaret, toward the open archive. "I'm done pretending," Daniel said quietly. Richard's expression darkened. "You don't understand what you're doing." Daniel shook his head. "No, for the first time, I do." Margaret exhaled softly. Emily's shoulders relaxed just slightly. Caleb nodded once. Not in victory, in recognition. Because the real battle had never been about documents, or land, or history. It had always been about choice. And now the choice had been made. Richard looked around the room one last time, at the people standing against him, at the truth he could no longer fully control. Then he smiled again. But this time it didn't reach his eyes. "This isn't over," he said. Caleb's voice remained steady. "It already is." Richard turned and walked out. The door closed behind him. And with that, the weight of decades began to shift. Not all at once, not loudly, but undeniably. Because for the first time in a very long time, Ashgrove was no longer hiding from its own story. Morning came to Ashgrove with a different kind of light. Not brighter, not warmer, but clearer, as if something long buried beneath the town had finally shifted, allowing the truth to rise slowly to the surface. Caleb Snyder stood at the front steps of the library, watching the sun stretch across the quiet streets. The same road, the same houses, the same familiar stillness, but none of it felt the same anymore. Behind him, the doors of the Carnegie Library stood open, not abandoned, not forgotten, open. Margaret joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to him without speaking, her fingers brushing his briefly steady, grounded, certain. "They'll come," she said softly. Caleb nodded. "I know." They didn't have to wait long. The first to arrive was Emily Brooks. She walked quickly, determination written across her face, a folder tucked under her arm. Behind her came Walter Green, the retired judge, his slow but deliberate steps carrying the weight of decades of legal experience and perhaps quiet regret. Then came others. A mechanic, a teacher, an elderly woman leaning on a cane, a young couple holding hands. At first only a handful, then more. Word had spread. Not through whispers this time, through something stronger: curiosity, concern, and something else. Hope. Margaret stepped inside to prepare. Caleb remained at the entrance, greeting each person with a simple nod. No speeches, no explanations. Just an invitation. Come in. See for yourself. Inside the library, the main reading room had been arranged carefully. On the central tables lay selected documents: photographs, letters, scholarship records, medical assistance notes, pieces of lives once hidden. Not everything. Not yet. Just enough to show the truth without overwhelming it. Emily stood near the front, speaking quietly to those who entered. "This isn't speculation," she explained. "These are original records." Walter Green reviewed documents silently. His brow furrowed his fingers, tracing signatures and dates with practiced precision. After several minutes, he looked up. "They're real," he said simply. That was all it took. A murmur spread through the room. People moved closer, reading, studying, recognizing. An elderly man stopped suddenly, staring at a photograph. "That's my father," he whispered. No one responded immediately. They didn't need to. The truth was speaking for itself. Margaret watched from a distance, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Caleb stepped beside her. "You okay?" She nodded, though her eyes glistened slightly. "This is what she wanted," she said. "Clara, yes." Caleb followed her gaze. "Then we keep going." Margaret looked at him, all the way. Before Caleb could respond, the doors opened again. This time the room fell silent. Ryan Snyder stepped inside. Caleb didn't move. Margaret's breath caught softly beside him. Ryan looked different. Not physically, but something in his posture had shifted. The confidence that once defined him now seemed uncertain, measured. He walked slowly into the room, his eyes moving across the documents, the people, the truth, unfolding in front of him. He stopped a few feet from Caleb. Neither spoke at first. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. "I didn't believe it." Caleb's voice remained calm. "Believe what?" "That you would do something like this." Margaret stepped forward slightly, something like what Ryan gestured toward the room. "This. All of this." Caleb met his son's gaze. "Neither did I." Ryan looked away briefly. "I thought you'd move on." Caleb's expression didn't change. "We lost everything, Ryan." Ryan flinched slightly at the name. "I know." "No," Caleb said quietly. "You don't." A long silence stretched between them. Not angry, not explosive, just honest. Ryan looked around the room again, at the people, at the documents, at the truth. "They're saying this changes things," he said. "It does," Emily replied from across the room. Ryan looked at her. How Walter Green stepped forward. Legally, Ryan nodded. Walter held up one of the documents. These records proved that portions of land were transferred under false pretenses. Ryan frowned. "That was decades ago." Walter nodded. "And never corrected." Ryan's voice tightened. "So, what happens now?" Caleb answered. "Now, people decide what they're willing to live with." Ryan looked at him. "And you?" Caleb didn't hesitate. "I'm done living with lies." The words landed heavily. Ryan lowered his gaze. "I didn't know," he said quietly. Margaret spoke gently. "You didn't ask." Ryan swallowed. "I thought I was helping." Caleb nodded slowly. "I know." That surprised Ryan. "You do, yes." Caleb's voice remained steady. "You believed success meant more than what we had." Ryan looked up, his eyes searching. "And you didn't." Caleb smiled faintly. "I used to think what we had was enough." Ryan hesitated, and now Caleb glanced around the room, at the people rediscovering their history, at the stories being brought back into the light. "At least now," he said softly, "we know what it really was." Ryan stood still for a long moment. "Then I want to help." Margaret looked at him carefully. "Help?" How Ryan took a breath. "Whatever comes next." Caleb studied his son. Not the businessman. Not the man who had made a decision that cost them everything, but the boy he once knew. The one who had painted Christmas ornaments and believed in things that couldn't be measured in profit. "This isn't about fixing one mistake," Caleb said. Ryan nodded. "I know it's about facing all of them." Ryan's voice was steady now. "I'm ready." Caleb didn't respond immediately. Then he stepped forward, placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But not rejection either. A beginning. Behind them, the room continued to fill. More people, more voices, more recognition. The truth spreading not as chaos, but as understanding. Margaret wiped a quiet tear from her cheek. "It's happening," she whispered. Caleb nodded. Yes. Outside the town of Ashgrove remained as it always had. But beneath that surface, everything was changing. The library no longer stood as an abandoned building. It had become something else. A place of memory, a place of truth, a place where stories long buried had finally found their way home. Weeks later, the decision came. The demolition was canceled. The Carnegie Library was declared a protected historical landmark. Clara Whitmore's name was restored, not just in documents, but in memory. And Caleb and Margaret Snyder, the couple who had arrived with nothing stayed, not because they had nowhere else to go, but because they had found something worth staying for. The bookcase never opened again. It didn't need to. Its purpose had been fulfilled. Because the truth it had protected for so long no longer needed to hide. And in the quiet moments when sunlight filtered through the tall windows and laughter echoed softly between the shelves, it almost felt as though the library itself was at peace. As if somewhere deep within its walls, a long-forgotten voice had finally been heard.